You might imagine a great empire like the Aztecs focused mostly on war gods and gold, but behind the dramatic sacrifice stones and bustling causeways of Tenochtitlan was something quieter, something almost invisible, the culture of dreams. You were never entirely alone when you slept in this city. Whether you were a nobleman or a humble maize grinder, someone or something was always watching your dreams. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, where chinampas shimmered by day and torches flickered by night, there were individuals known not for their prowess with weapons, but for their patience beside sleeping bodies. These were the Tetlasuiloque, dream watchers, not priests, not warriors, not midwives, just trained observers. Their entire purpose was to sit by someone as they slept, observe their movements, listen to their murmurs, and, if the dreamer agreed, record what they remembered upon waking. Why? Because the Aztecs believed that dreams were messages from gods, ancestors, or even enemies. They believed the sleeping soul traveled to the underworld, to the heavens, or to other cities. What it saw could reveal truth, but it could also bring danger. So a small class of educated, quiet recorders emerged. These dream watchers were trained in interpreting signs, how a foot twitch could mean fear, how a muttered word like ATL, water, might connect to Tlaloc or omens of flooding. It was, of course, an art more than a science. But in a world where maize growth was predicted by eclipses, and a sneeze could mean divine punishment, dreams were no small matter. Let's imagine a young nobleman, perhaps 15 years old, lying in the sleeping quarters of the palace school, the Kamakak. His name is lost to time, as most names are, but what we know is this. Every night a dream watcher sat just beside his reed mat. A little oil lamp burned low. The watcher didn't sleep. They noted how many times the noble stirred, how long it took him to fall asleep if he whispered, "If." He trembled. At sunrise the noble would wake and be asked a single soft question. Did you see anything? If he had dreamed of fire or drowning, this would be taken to the priest. If he saw a jaguar devouring a man in white, that might mean war or a secret fear. And if he dreamed of nothing, if his night was blank, there would be concern. The gods had not visited. Tenochtitlan was a city of immense order. Its markets were regulated down to the type of corn sold. Even sleep was structured. In wealthier homes, dream watchers were hired like scribes or cooks. For the elite, a well-documented dream life was a status symbol, a way to show spiritual connection, divine favor, and psychological strength. Some even claimed that Moctezuma himself kept 3 dream watchers and dictated his dreams each morning before meeting his generals. The dream itself wasn't the only part that mattered. The surrounding signs, smells, noises, moon phase were all recorded. A sneeze before sleep might be a bad omen. A dog howling during the night could ruin the message. So dream watchers also acted as protectors of dream space, placing protective charms near sleeping heads, burning herbs to ward off confusing spirits, and ensuring no one disturbed the dreamer's link to the gods. The codices of the time, such as the Codex Mendoza and the Florentine Codex, offer glimpses into these rituals. Though the illustrations tend to favor the more dramatic aspects of Aztec life, warriors, gods, ceremonies, notes about dreams are hidden in the margins. In Nahuatl, the word for dream, cochi, carries multiple meanings: to sleep, to dream, to rest. This overlap tells you how tightly the Aztecs wove meaning into the very act of closing one's eyes. And it wasn't just for nobles. Pregnant women, before giving birth, were often watched during sleep for signs of what kind of soul was coming into the world. A dream of water might mean the child would be tied to Tlaloc and perhaps become a healer. A dream of falling, that child might not survive its first year. Then there were the traders, men who traveled to faraway cities like Xochimilco or Tlaxcala. Before setting out, they would be required to sleep in the temple lodging for 2 nights, with a dream watcher beside them. If the dreams were bad, the trip would be delayed. In one recorded instance from the Codex Magliabeciano, a trader dreamed of losing a sandal in a river. The priests took this as a warning and refused to bless his departure. He left anyway. According to legend, he never returned. One of the more unusual details from this period is the presence of dream catalogues. In temples and scholarly houses, there were reed-bound books or bundles of bark paper that listed dream symbols and their meanings, an ancient dictionary of the subconscious. These were not open to the public. Only priests, elders, and trained dream watchers had access. The symbols weren't static. Meanings could shift depending on the dreamer's age, gender, or role in society. A white flower seen by a priest might mean purity, seen by a young girl. It could mean an early death. This system of dream observation raises a question that echoes softly across time. How much of a person's fate was decided while they slept? Because if dreams were signs, and signs were interpreted by others, then your very future, marriage, career, travel, could be shaped not by your waking actions, but by what someone else said you saw at night. It's easy, from our modern viewpoint, to dismiss this. Dreams are just neurons firing, some say, just brain static. But to the Aztecs, dreams were roads, and those roads were real. They had rules, guardians, signs, and watchers. In fact, among the Tetlaswiloque, it was believed that if one kept watch over enough dreams, one would eventually begin dreaming the dreams of others. A sort of sleep empathy. Some even claimed to carry dreams from one sleeper to another. Was it superstition, or simply a way to make sense of connection? Even now, the idea of someone watching over you while you sleep is a strange mixture of comfort and eeriness. But in Tenochtitlan, it was neither. It was simply normal. And so each night in homes of stone and reed, in temples and noble quarters, men and women closed their eyes and trusted that their dreams would be seen, written, and remembered. Not for fame, not for vanity, but for survival. Because the gods were always watching, and sometimes their messages were quiet. Sometimes they came only in sleep. You wake still lying on a woven mat. The chill of the stone floor underneath seeps through the reed mat, and a faint scent of burning copal still lingers. The dream is already fading. Something about a lake, something about your mother's voice. The man sitting beside you, dressed in plain cotton robes, doesn't smile. He just says softly, "Tell me what you saw." This quiet daily ritual played out across Tenochtitlan in hundreds of homes, schools, and temples. But for the Tetlaswiloque, the dream watchers, it was only the beginning. What they heard, they had to translate, not just into language, but into meaning. Dreams came in symbols. A jaguar might mean war. A mountain could represent power or an obstacle. Water almost always meant emotion or travel. And fire was unpredictable. It could be divine punishment, love, or destruction. The dream watchers didn't invent the meanings. They consulted long-established dream catalogues passed down through generations, some painted on ametal bark scrolls, others recited from memory. Dream catalogue from one of the priest schools in Tlatelolco, now lost but referenced by early Spanish friars, listed over 300 symbols. And each symbol had multiple meanings depending on context. A white dog running across water could mean loyalty. But if that same dog barked before crossing, betrayal was near. The nuance was endless. But perhaps the most telling part of the Aztec dream belief system was this: not everyone was allowed to interpret dreams. Dream interpretation was a controlled practice. In a theocratic society where priests and rulers controlled both spiritual and civic life, dream meanings were tightly guarded. To interpret your own dream without the blessing of a priest was considered foolish at best, dangerous at worst. In one known case recorded by Bernardino de Sahagún, in the Florentine Codex, a farmer claimed that he dreamt of a hummingbird entering his chest. He believed this was a sign of good fortune, but a local dream priest disagreed. He insisted it meant the man had been chosen for sacrifice. Whether true or not, the story ends with the farmer vanishing days later, never seen again. This sense of danger surrounding dreams created a kind of reverence and fear around sleep. In the Karmakak, the school for noble children, students were taught not only how to report dreams, but how to shape them. Before bed, students were given small objects, tokens of obsidian, maize kernels, dried flowers, to place under their mats or in their hands. These were known as tlazol. Each token was meant to guide the dream toward a specific domain: nature, ancestors, warfare, or healing. But it wasn't foolproof. Dreams were not always obedient. Take, for instance, a merchant recorded in the Codex, Ixtlilxochitl. Before a long journey, he fasted for 2 days and placed 4 cacao beans under his sleeping mat, hoping to receive a vision of safe passage. Instead, he dreamed of blood running down the steps of a pyramid. The priest claimed this meant he would encounter a fallen city. A month later, he returned with strange goods and a story of finding an abandoned trading post in ruins. Evidence of conflict, but no one left to tell the tale. There's another layer to all this: the political use of dreams. When an emperor dreamt, it mattered. And so his dreams were not just recorded, they were evaluated by a council of priests, scribes, and astronomers. One of the most famous examples of this occurred during the reign of Moctezuma II. Several years before the Spanish arrived, Moctezuma reportedly had a series of troubling dreams. He dreamed of comets streaking across the sky, of temples falling into the lake, of people with burning faces emerging from the east. According to accounts written down by Sahagun, himself relying on Aztec elders, these dreams caused Moctezuma to become withdrawn and uneasy. He summoned the empire's highest dream watchers to interpret the signs, and this is where things get blurry. Some elders interpreted the dreams as warnings about internal rebellion. Others claimed it meant the gods were displeased with the tribute system. A few, perhaps the most daring, suggested that it meant a foreign force was coming. But they couldn't say from where or when. What we know is this: after these dreams, Moctezuma reportedly ordered the temples to burn more incense, increased sacrifices, and changed sleeping quarters to a quieter part of the palace. He even dismissed 2 of his longtime dream watchers, perhaps out of fear that their readings had grown too honest. One of the more curious traditions tied to imperial dreams was the dream sealing ritual. If a noble had a particularly important or prophetic dream, it would not be told immediately. Instead, a priest would write the key symbols on a piece of bark or deer hide, fold it into a small bundle, and seal it using a waxy resin. The dream would be hidden away for a set number of days, typically 13. Only after that time could it be reopened and interpreted. The delay, it was believed, gave the gods time to adjust fate, should the dream have been too powerful or disruptive. A fragment of such a sealed dream was uncovered in the ruins of a minor temple outside Tenochtitlan in the 1970s. The symbols were crude and difficult to decipher, but among them was the image of a bird swallowing the sun, an omen associated with both eclipse and invasion. Did anyone heed it? We cannot know. Beyond the temples and noble houses, commoners had their own ways of interpreting dreams. A mother might dream of her child falling and take it as a sign to keep the child indoors. A fisherman might dream of a net filled with snakes and cancel his morning trip. There were even local dream speakers, unofficial interpreters, who set up mats at the markets and offered readings in exchange for food or coins. They were sometimes accused of sorcery, sometimes ignored, but they were always busy. The significance of all this is not the literal belief, but the practical role dreams played. In a world with no weather forecasts, no psychological therapy, and no scientific model of the mind, dreams were a mirror. They revealed things you couldn't say aloud: fears, guilt, ambition. They were a space where the powerless could be warned and the powerful could be humbled. It's also worth noting how quiet this part of Aztec life was. For all the noise and fire and pageantry of public rituals, drums beating on temple steps, warriors shouting in tribute ceremonies, dreams were processed in whispers. They took place in soft corners of reed homes. They lived on in charcoal lines on bark paper. They lingered only as long as memory allowed, And yet, despite their gentleness, dreams could shift policy, change marriages, halt wars, move mountains. There's a moment recorded by a Spanish priest in the early 1500s. He describes walking through the outskirts of the city and seeing a group of children sleeping in the open air. A woman sat beside them with a bowl of incense. When he asked what she was doing, she replied, "I'm keeping their dreams from being stolen." Even as the empire collapsed, even as Spanish ships approached the coast, there were still mothers keeping watch over dreams. And so we're left with a quiet question, one that even the most devout Tetlashuiloque might have whispered to themselves, before drifting off under obsidian stars. If a dream can be seen, written, and remembered, can it be changed before it comes true? As dawn rises over the calm waters of Lake Texcoco, the last reeds of mist swirl low around the causeways of Tenochtitlan. The empire still stands, for now, but the air is thick with rumors. Strange men, with pale faces, are said to be crossing the sea. Their weapons are louder than thunder. Their animals walk on four legs, but they are not deer. And their dreams, it is said, are dark and bloodless. In this final chapter of our story, we watch not only the decline of an empire, but the slow extinction of a quieter tradition, the role of dreams. You see, when the Spanish arrived, they didn't just bring swords and ships. They brought a different worldview, a worldview where dreams were personal, unrecorded, and unimportant, seen as superstition, not insight. To the friars and chroniclers who followed Cortés, the idea of spending entire nights beside sleeping nobles with a piece of charcoal and reed paper was not just strange. It was threatening. And yet, they took notes. Some Spanish friars, particularly Bernardino de Sahagún and Diego Durán, were fascinated by the role dreams played in Aztec life. They observed how dreams influenced decisions, guided ceremonies, and even determined who would live or die. Sahagún's Florentine Codex includes long sections where native elders, often interviewed under pressure, describe what it was like to live in a world where you were never truly alone, not even in sleep. But even as they wrote these things down, the old system was breaking apart. The Tetlashuiloque, the Dream Watchers, were among the first to lose their place in society. Their roles were tied to religious rituals now banned under Spanish rule. The codices that contained generations of dream symbolism were either hidden away or destroyed. In some cases, they were burned in great piles alongside idols, figurines, and temple scrolls. Not because the Spaniards feared dreams, but because they feared what dreams represented, a system of meaning outside their control. For a while, some dream watchers adapted. They became scribes, assistants to friars or folk healers, but their practice of sitting in silence beside sleeping bodies, recording symbols and consulting the spirits, that practice faded like smoke. In an open temple, it's tempting to imagine that with the fall of the Aztec Empire, the dreams of the people ceased to matter. But that isn't true. The dreams kept coming. Even in the decades following the conquest, elders in small villages around Lake Texcoco continued to observe dreams. In some communities, people still placed dried marigolds under their pillows. Others whispered their dreams into running water, hoping the spirits would hear and protect them. Some dream symbols changed. The eagle once symbolized strength and sun. After conquest, it became a sign of vigilance. The jaguar, once sacred to warriors, began to appear in dreams as a reminder of lost pride. And the Spanish themselves entered native dreams, not as conquerors, but as shadowy figures, half divine, half monstrous. Children would wake crying after seeing a man with metal skin walking through the maize fields. Some of these dreams were recorded much later, by Nahua historians in colonial schools, passed quietly from memory to paper. Among the many untold stories of the post-conquest years is that of Xochitl, a young girl who lived near the ruins of the old sacred precinct. Her story survives only in fragments from a colonial-era Nahuatl text translated by a friar. According to the text, Xochitl began speaking her dreams aloud at night, reciting full conversations in Nahuatl that no one recognized. Her grandmother, a former dream scribe, claimed these were the voices of the drowned gods, the spirits of Tlaloc and Calcutlicue, left behind in the lake. A friar tried to intervene. He told the family to silence the child, to pray over her. But the dreams continued. One night, Xochitl awoke and said she saw the city rise again, but in silence, with no drums and no sky. The friar burned her mat, and so the dream faded. In time, Aztec dream interpretation was pushed underground. Surviving dream watchers passed their knowledge orally, disguising it as folklore or herbal healing. Some of their symbols blended with Catholic visions, dreams of saints, weeping virgins, bleeding moons. Others disappeared completely, their meanings lost to history. But here's the thing, while the tradition of recording dreams as official record vanished, the urge to explain dreams did not. To this day, in parts of central Mexico, there are communities where people still place basil or obsidian near their beds. Elders may still tell a pregnant woman to rest with a smooth stone beneath her feet, so her baby dreams of earth, not fire. In rural homes, children are sometimes taught not to talk loudly after someone has gone to sleep, so as not to disturb the spirit mid-journey. And sometimes when a child dreams of falling, they are told very gently, "It is only the gods reminding you where you came from." What began in Tenochtitlan didn't vanish. It changed form. And so we return to the question that has drifted across this story like fog on the lake. Can a dream, once forgotten, ever be recovered? We don't have bark, paper records anymore. We don't have dream watchers beside reed mats, nor temples built to listen to silence. But we still dream. And sometimes in that liminal space between waking and sleep, we feel something old, something that doesn't quite have words anymore, but still waits. Perhaps it is memory. Perhaps it is myth, or perhaps it is just the echo of a city that once believed dreams could shape the future. The Tetlahuileque are gone. Their scrolls are ash. Their voices are lost. But if you lie very still, just as the stars fade and the air cools and the soft weight of sleep begins to press in, you might still hear them, sitting beside you, waiting to write down what you see. Sleep well and dream gently. In the bustling, elevated city of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by floating gardens, guarded by volcanoes, and humming with the rhythms of tribute and trade, there existed places where silence ruled. Places set apart from the blood-colored altars and smoky marketplaces. These were not grand pyramids or royal courts. They were far quieter. They were sleep temples. You may never have heard of them. Even among Aztec ruins, they rarely appear in surviving stone. They were not built for spectacle. They were not places to gather or pray aloud. These were houses of rest. Not for common sleep, but for divine communion through sleep. The Aztec sleep temples, known by the Nahuatl name Xochicalco, literally house of sleep, were small, secluded structures found near major temple complexes and deep within certain Kamacac schools. They were reserved for the most sacred kind of rest, the kind believed to bring you face to face with the gods. These temples were not open to the general public. They were hidden behind walls or nestled beside inner courtyards, often shaded by layers of woven reed mats to block both sunlight and noise. They were dark, cooled by stone, and filled with faint fragrances of copal, crushed marigold, or wild tobacco. No images of violence were allowed inside, no weaponry, not even raised voices. And inside, just mats, blank walls, sometimes a simple carved idol, usually not more than a face or an eye. The rest was left empty, because here the belief was simple. When the body was emptied of distraction, the gods might finally speak. The sleep temples were not spaces for dreaming alone. They were used for ritual sleep, a sacred act practiced by chosen priests, midwives, seers, and occasionally those suffering from spiritual illness. The belief was that certain individuals could, under the right conditions, enter a state of rest where they would be visited by deities or ancestral spirits. To prepare for such a night required days of purification. The sleeper would fast. They would bathe in cool water infused with herbs like tlachichinol or white sage. They would eat no chili, no garlic, and speak only in whispers. Often, they would wear plain cotton garments and walk barefoot on cooled stones before entering the sleep chamber. The practice bore some resemblance to incubation rites in ancient Greek temples of Asclepius, though the Aztecs had likely never heard of them. Across the world, humans have sought divine answers in sleep, but the Aztecs did something particular. They formalized it, tracked it, and guarded its access with fierce discipline. One small structure in Tlatelolco, described in post-conquest writings, was noted as a temple where the wind was not allowed to enter. A poetic way of saying, no distraction, no noise, no movement, only sleep, darkness, and intention. But what made these places sacred? To the Aztecs, sleep was more than rest. It was travel, a chance for the soul, the tonali, to rise from the head and journey into the realms of the divine. The gods most often associated with this practice were Tezcatlipoca and Xolotl. Tezcatlipoca, the smoky mirror, god of night, fate, and sorcery, was believed to send visions or trials during sacred sleep. Xolotl, his brother, was the guide, leading souls safely through the dreamlands as he did the dead through Mictlan, the underworld. Some temples even had obsidian mirrors placed near the sleeper's head, framed in gold or bone. These were thought to help reflect visions more clearly into the soul's sight. And if a priest or chosen sleeper awoke and spoke a dream involving mirrors, wind, or footsteps in fog, it was taken extremely seriously. Sleep, after all, could warn of drought, or rebellion, or godly displeasure. Ritual sleep was not passive. It was deliberate submission to uncertainty. Sleepers were not seeking comfort. They were seeking meaning. Some were given strong teas brewed from calming flowers, especially cazahuate, or the now lost nenetal bloom, known only through old herbal texts. Others avoided all stimulants, relying only on breath control and sensory deprivation. The process could be harrowing. In one case, a woman recorded in early colonial documents had entered a sleep temple to determine why her children kept falling ill. For 3 nights she slept alone beside a statue of the goddess Coatlicue, the mother of gods. On the 4th day she awoke crying. She claimed the goddess had shown her blood pouring from her own heart. The temple priests took this as a sign of sacrifice, though not literal. Instead, they believed it meant she had to give up her life as a market seller and become a healer. She did. And according to the records, her children never fell ill again. The story feels strange to us now, foreign, symbolic, even a little uncomfortable. But in the Aztec worldview, it made perfect sense. Suffering had shape. Sleep could decode it. Temples often kept scrolls or clay tablets recording the outcomes of these sacred dreams. These were not kept in the open archives, but in Teotlcalli, God. Houses, locked storage rooms accessible only to high-ranking clergy. What was revealed in sacred sleep was considered too powerful to share widely. It could shift policy, move armies, even justify war. There is mention of a sleep temple in Cholula where a priest reportedly slept beside a bowl of still water for 7 nights. On the 8th morning, he awoke and described a vision of white birds landing on black ships. This was more than a decade before Cortés arrived. No one knew what it meant. But the record survived, scribbled into a friar's notebook decades later. Today we might call it coincidence, but the Aztecs had no word for coincidence, only signs. As you imagine these places, low, dim rooms of woven mats and silent guardians, you begin to realize something else. Sleep temples were one of the few spiritual spaces that required no performance. There were no drums, so when night fell, and the cool winds rolled in off the lake and the city lights began to dim, a chosen few would step quietly into these chambers. No one watched them. No one judged. They lay down in silence and hoped, perhaps, that the gods would visit them gently. But what did the gods say? What visions came and how were they understood? And more importantly, why did the sleep temples begin to vanish even before the empire itself fell? The Aztecs built their world on cycles, cycles of sun, of rain, of time itself. They believed that the universe had been created and destroyed multiple times, and that every era, every sun as they called it, had its own beginning and its own end. And just as the cosmos moved in rhythms, so too did the Aztecs approach to sacred sleep. It was not enough to build a quiet room and lie in it. To enter a sleep temple, to truly participate in the sacred act of kochistli or divine rest, was to accept a role in a cosmic performance, even if that performance happened in stillness and silence. Ritual sleep wasn't done on a whim. It was timed carefully with lunar phases, agricultural cycles, and temple calendars. Certain nights were considered more porous, nights when the barriers between worlds were thinner, when the gods might slip into a sleeper's dream more easily. These often included nights leading up to key festivals such as Tlaxoquimco, the offering of flowers, or Micailhuitontli, the feast of the dead. Priests and scholars consulted Tonalpohualli, the 260-day sacred calendar, to determine auspicious nights. Days ruled by certain deities, like Itztli associated with obsidian and clarity, were favored for seeking sharp visions. Others, like days ruled by Mictlantecutli, god of the underworld, were avoided unless one was brave enough to ask questions of the dead. Let's return to one of those small reed-covered chambers tucked behind the house of the Eagle Knights in Tenochtitlan. Tonight, a young apprentice priest prepares for ritual sleep. He has fasted for 2 days. His last meal was a bowl of amaranth mixed with honey, a food believed to sweeten the path between this world and the dream realm. His feet are clean, his body cooled with water, scented with wild basil. A fine layer of charcoal has been smeared across his forehead, not for protection but to signal to the gods that he does not seek to hide. He lies on a simple mat. Beside him, a shallow bowl filled with clean river water reflects a single candle's glow. There is no pillow, no blanket, only the rhythmic sound of his breath and the scent of crushed Shempolxochitl marigold burning faintly in the corner. A senior priest waits nearby, watching not out of curiosity, but duty. If the apprentice mutters, stirs, cries out, these movements will be recorded. If he awakens and forgets the dream, nothing will be written. But if he remembers and dares to speak it, it will be transcribed in full on amate bark paper before the sun rises. Because in this temple, no vision is too small. The dreams reported in these spaces ranged from the symbolic to the strangely precise. There are stories, half lost in fragmented colonial transcriptions, of dreams involving bleeding maize walking mountains or a single feather floating against a dark sky. But there were also dreams more practical. One temple record tells of a farmer who, after participating in a community ritual sleep session, dreamed of burying his tools beneath a specific tree. When he did so upon waking, he unearthed a clay vessel filled with ancient offerings, obsidian blades, carved beads, perhaps left centuries before. The village elders took this as a sign that the land was sacred and a new altar was built nearby. Another account, a healer dreamed of a woman wrapped in smoke. The next day, she treated a child for an unknown illness, one that cleared only after a purification involving burnt herbs and obsidian ash. Coincidence? Perhaps. But to the Aztecs, such alignments weren't accidents. They were tlahuelilok, moments of revealed clarity. What made sacred dreams special wasn't their content alone, but who had them and where. Dreams outside the temples could be helpful, but they were seen as vulnerable to misdirection or interference. Only in the protected stillness of a sleep temple could the gods be expected to speak with clarity. And yet not all visions brought comfort. There are unsettling records too. Priests waking in cold terror, visions of endless descent, of staircases leading downward without end, of mirrors filled with screaming mouths. One account tells of a woman who refused to speak for weeks after her temple sleep, clutching her stomach and murmuring, "The bones were not mine, the bones were not mine." Her vision was interpreted as a warning to avoid a specific burial ground, and for years no one entered it. These moments were not dismissed, they were preserved, and most importantly, they were acted upon. In fact, the Aztecs often used dreams as final evidence when deciding disputes that could not be settled through law. In cases of inheritance, crop failure, or even political decisions, a dream obtained during temple sleep could sway the course of action. A vision of a snake beneath a house might be enough to delay a wedding. A dream of a bird circling a hill could be used to justify a change in tribute policy. But with this power came fragility. As the Aztec Empire expanded and pressure mounted to maintain tribute and control, fewer resources were devoted to spiritual infrastructure like sleep temples. Some were repurposed into storage, others fell into disuse. Still others were restricted to only the highest clergy, excluding common healers or women practitioners. It's in this tightening of control that we begin to see the quiet fading of the practice. There were whispers among some elder priests that the gods were speaking less, that dreams had become noisy or confusing. Perhaps it was the rise of political instability. Perhaps it was fear of misinterpreting a sign and being punished. Or perhaps, as one old dream scribe reportedly said, the people forgot how to lie still. And then came the conquest. As Spanish forces advanced, temples were looted and sacred sites defiled. The sleep temples, so quiet, so unassuming, were often overlooked in the first waves. But as Christian friars established missions and converted indigenous priests, these rooms were closed or rebranded. One friar wrote in a 1540 report, "There are small houses in which the Indians go to lie upon mats and await visitations from their devils. They say these dreams are sent by their gods, but we must drive out such heresies with firmness." In some towns, sleep temples were turned into chapels. Others were demolished. A few were quietly preserved by local families who still believed in their power. A traveler's note from the early 1600s describes a village east of Chalco, where old women still entered a house of silence once a month to ask the night what it needed. No records remain of what they saw. It is painful sometimes to imagine how something so gentle, so rooted in stillness, could disappear so quickly. There are no ruins marked as Aztec sleep temples today, no museum displays of reed mats or sleeping chambers. They were not grand, they were not decorated, and so they left little behind. But what they offered, the invitation to listen while sleeping, to seek not answers but meaning, still hums beneath the surface of modern dreams. When you close your eyes tonight and listen to the hush that gathers behind your thoughts, when an image comes, soft and unexplained, a face, a word, a symbol you can't quite place, who is to say that the gods of old aren't still speaking? Perhaps the dream temples never truly vanished. Perhaps they simply moved inside us. It is said that silence is the first language of the gods. In the high windless nights over the lakes of the Valley of Mexico, before cannon fire echoed across its causeways, there were places where silence was carefully preserved, not by chance but by architecture, by ritual and by intention. As we return one last time to the sleep temples of the Aztecs, we are left with not grand monuments or lavish stonework, but something far more elusive: the memory of stillness, the belief that lying still in sacred darkness could open a passageway to truth. By the late 1400s, just a few decades before the Spanish invasion, these sleep temples were already beginning to decline, not due to doubt, but to bureaucracy. As Tenochtitlan grew in size and power, more energy was invested in military campaigns, economic infrastructure, and state festivals. The empire had grown vast, with tribute flowing in from dozens of client city-states, and with that size came pressure to predict harvests, to maintain order, to prevent dissent. Ritual sleep, especially the unsupervised kind, became a threat to that order. You see, sleep temples were not centrally governed. Though some were attached to formal schools or temple precincts, many were run by independent orders of priestesses, midwives, or healer families. Their records were private. Their insights, especially if they contradicted imperial needs, were potentially dangerous. They say I dreamt of falling feathers, or I saw my grandmother carrying a bowl of fire, or I heard a baby crying but couldn't find it. And Citlali nods. She says, "That's good. That means the child is strong. That means the child will not be alone." She no longer writes the dreams down, but she remembers them, each one like a seed tucked inside the folds of her memory, because even if the temples are gone, and the codices burned, and the gods renamed, the dreams remain. In villages around the former empire, fragments of the old practices continued. A mother might wake from a troubling dream and sprinkle salt near the cradle. A grandmother might place a small clay figure near the baby's head to guide the sleep. A healer might still ask about a dream before preparing a remedy, not because anyone told them to, but because it still feels right. These are the embers of a lost fire. The Spanish colonizers, in their conquest of Mesoamerica, succeeded in transforming public ritual. Temples were converted to churches. Priests were retrained as scribes. Sacred calendars were outlawed. But private knowledge, the kind held in whispers and sleep, was harder to touch. By the 1700s, few remembered the Nahuatl word tlamatl quitiquitl. But midwives remained. Some wore crosses, some read psalms. But when the lights were low and a woman cried out in labor, they reached for the oldest knowledge they knew: how to breathe, how to hold, how to ask, how to listen. And sometimes, sometimes they would ask the question, "Did you dream last night?" This quiet survival mattered, because it meant that the Aztecs did not fully lose their way of knowing. It meant that the soul of the tradition, its gentleness, its respect for sleep as a window into the sacred, continued to live. Not in stone or script, but in people. The modern world would later dismiss dream reading as folklore, pseudoscience, or rural superstition. But what those critiques often miss is the human reason behind the practice. When a midwife asked about a dream, she wasn't just gathering prophecy, she was saying, "You matter. Your fears matter. Your experience matters. And the gods might still be listening." There is an emotional clarity in that belief, a kind of medicine not made from herbs, but from attention. Today, scholars continue to search for the lost records of Aztec dream interpretation. A few codices remain, heavily damaged. There are symbols we can't yet read, stories we can't yet place, meanings we may never recover. And yet, the practice survives in echoes. A woman wakes from a vivid dream and tells her mother. A child whimpers in sleep and is gently turned over to the right side. A midwife in Oaxaca hums an old lullaby with lyrics no one remembers how to translate. And across all this, there is something deeply Aztec: the belief that dreams speak truth, the belief that birth and sleep and spirit are bound together, the belief that care begins before the first cry. So if you ever find yourself sitting beside someone expecting new life, and they begin to describe their dreams, don't dismiss them. Don't say it's just the mind. Instead, lean in. Ask, what did you see? Because you're not just hearing a dream. You're hearing a story older than empires. A whisper passed down from Citlali and Chicautli and countless others who lay no claim to greatness, only to presence, the presence of hands held in labor, of breaths counted beside mats, of symbols remembered even as the world changed. And so we close this story with the softest of truths. Midwives read dreams not to shape the future, but to honor it. To understand why an Aztec family might sleep with a blade beside their bed, you have to first forget everything you know about comfort. In modern times, we speak of bedrooms as sanctuaries, places of softness, security, and retreat. But for the Aztecs, night was not a neutral space. It was a time of risk, of thin barriers between worlds, a time when the spirits walked. And so, beside the woven mats of homes, both rich and poor, there was often a small bundle, a few strands, kopel, a carved figure of a god, and an obsidian blade. Not for war, not for hunting, but for protection from the unseen. The blade was called a tecpatl, small, sharp, often made of volcanic glass. To the modern eye, it might seem more ceremonial than useful. But to the Aztecs, it held symbolic and spiritual power far beyond its edges. It was the embodiment of sacrifice, yes, but also clarity, cutting truth and above all defense against night forces, because sleep, in Aztec belief, was not passive. It was a journey of the soul, one that left the body vulnerable. The tonali, or animating life force, was thought to rise from the head during sleep, traveling through unseen pathways to the spirit world. If it returned safely by morning, the dreamer awoke unharmed. But if it was blocked, stolen, or damaged, the body might weaken. Or worse. This was where the tekpatl came in. Placed beside the bed, it was believed to guard the resting soul, not by fighting intruders in the physical sense, but by warding off spiritual predators. Among the many beings feared at night, one of the most dreaded was the tsitsimime, celestial star demons who roamed the skies after dark. They were said to descend during solar eclipses and were blamed for miscarriages, sudden illness, and nightmares. Though invisible to most, they were known to strike silently. Their presence detected only through the restless tossing of sleepers or the cries of children. The obsidian knife was believed to deter them, not because it could injure them physically, but because obsidian was sacred, tied to Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, fate, and sorcery. In essence, the blade signaled to the spirit world, this soul is watched. This soul is protected. But not all spirits were demonic. There were also the chivateteo, ghosts of women who had died in childbirth, revered yet feared. These wandering souls were believed to haunt crossroads and homes, especially seeking newborns, and mothers who had not properly cleansed themselves. If a baby grew sick in the night, some would say, a civateteo passed through the room. To protect against such dangers, Aztec households developed bedside rituals. Salt was sprinkled near doorways. Small figures of Xolotl, the underworld guide, were placed beneath mats. Ashes were drawn into thin lines along the wall, creating symbolic barriers. And the obsidian blade was placed on the eastern side of the bed, where the sun would first rise to encourage the return of the wandering tonali. These practices were not limited to the elite. In rural homes made of wattle and daub, families followed the same rules. Night was democratic in its danger, and the knife, for all its symbolism, had practical value too. In times of war or unrest, a sudden noise at night might require immediate defense. The tekpatl, sharp and within reach, was better than nothing. There are recorded cases, though rare, of householders actually using the obsidian knife to fend off thieves or attackers. But in truth, the blade's real power was psychological. It gave sleepers courage. A child frightened by dreams of jaguars or drowned gods could be reassured by the presence of the knife. A mother nursing a newborn through the feverish night might place her hand on its handle and whisper a prayer not found in codices, but passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The prayer usually began, "Guard this house, blade of night. Cut what would cross from shadow into breath." There is something deeply human about this gesture, the belief that a simple object, sharp, gleaming, still, could create a boundary between harm and home. But obsidian was not just placed near beds. Some warriors, especially those who had survived serious wounds, were known to sleep holding this blade itself. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a way to remain tethered to their identity. For an Aztec warrior, the line between life and death, body and spirit, was thin. Holding a blade as you slept was a reminder that even in rest you were prepared to face the gods. Yet not everyone approved. Some priests argued that sleeping with a tekpatl too close to the body might cause confusion for the returning soul, especially if the blade had been used in previous sacrifices. Obsidian, after all, absorbs energy. It reflects, it mirrors. If charged incorrectly, they believed it might lead to strange dreams, or worse, possession. So, care had to be taken. Blades used in warfare were cleaned before being used as household. Talismans. A few were wrapped in white cotton, blessed with Tezcatlipoca flowers, and dedicated specifically to sleep protection. This level of care reflects a broader Aztec truth, that objects held multiple layers of meaning. A knife was never just a knife. It was a line, a mirror, a message. It could cut food, flesh, or fear, and in the dark, When the mind wandered and the soul traveled and the stars turned behind layers of smoke, the knife stayed, still, watching. It's easy to look back on this with modern eyes and see only myth, but to do so would be to miss the deeper truth, that for all their complexity and ceremony, the Aztecs understood something simple. Night is vulnerable. Sleep is surrender. Protection, even symbolic, matters. And so they slept with knives, not out of violence but out of care. In the next part of this story, we'll explore what happened when the blade failed, when the protections didn't hold, when night spirits broke through and dreams turned dangerous. How did the Aztecs respond to spiritual invasion? What rituals emerged to cleanse a soul once harmed? Because in a world where even the gods traveled by night, the question was never whether darkness would come, but whether you'd be ready to meet it. For all their rituals, for all the obsidian blades carefully placed at bedsides, the Aztecs knew one unavoidable truth. Sometimes the night got in anyway. No object, no chant, no amulet was entirely foolproof. And when the spiritual defenses failed, when the tonali returned fragmented or not at all, the people turned not to weapons but to ritual, repair, and remembrance. Let's begin with the most feared result of failed night protection, soul sickness. This condition, known as tonal nemolistli, the disordered life force, was marked by a sudden shift in behavior upon waking. A person might become withdrawn, forgetful, confused. In worse cases, they might speak nonsense, claim to have seen spirits in the room, or become unable to walk. The Aztecs believed this happened when the tonali, the animating energy that traveled, during dreams was blocked from re-entering the body, or returned altered. Not missing, but different, twisted by contact with dangerous forces. And so the question was, what went wrong? Was the obsidian blade not cleansed? Was the wrong deity invoked? Was there a spirit in the house no one noticed? The diagnosis always began with observation. Healer, sometimes the family's midwife, sometimes a tisital, a physician priest, would ask about the person's last sleep. What they saw, how they felt before and after. They would examine the body for signs, a cold forehead, a missing shadow, a twitch in the fingers when held in silence. Then would come the ritual. The most common cure was known as the recalling of the soul, a ceremonial act in which the person's tonali was invited back, coaxed into returning. To do this, the healer would burn yoloxochitl, a heart-shaped flower known to be favored by Xolotl, the soul guide. The scent would fill the home and the afflicted would be asked to lie still. Around them, the family would place familiar objects, a favorite bowl, a garment, a piece of obsidian. The healer would then whisper again and again, "Come back. This is your place. You are not lost." Sometimes this worked immediately. The person would sigh, shift, and awaken with clarity. Other times, the ritual had to be repeated across several nights. If unsuccessful after 13 days, a sacred number, the case was considered dire. In such situations, the blade that failed to protect would be buried, not discarded, not destroyed, buried in salt and soil, as one would bury the dead. Because even a failed blade deserved respect. It had tried. And failure in Aztec thought was not always weakness. It was often seen as imbalance, something to be mourned, not punished. There were other forms of night attack as well. Sometimes a person would awaken violently, screaming, clawing at the air, claiming to have been chased in dreams. These episodes, called its popoyotl or mirror panic, were believed to result from looking too deeply into the spiritual mirror of Tezcatlipoca. In these cases, the soul had not just wandered, it had seen something it was not meant to see. To heal this, the person would undergo a mirror-shielding ritual. An obsidian disc, similar to the ones used by priests for divination, would be wrapped in black cotton and placed at the foot of the bed. Each night, prayers were whispered over it, asking the god to turn his gaze away. Obsidian, after all, was not a passive material. It reflects, it absorbs, it remembers. The Aztecs knew this and treated the substance not as a tool, but as a being. Before placing a blade beside the bed, it was common to speak to it, to say softly, "You are the mouth of night, guard us gently." Some families passed blades down through generations, objects used in sleep protection, wrapped carefully, never allowed to touch blood. These heirlooms were stored with maize seeds and woven belts, tied into bundles called tla-til-matel. Night. Keepers. They weren't just artifacts, they were memories. But as with all memory, sometimes it was the forgetting that caused danger. In one old story, recorded post-conquest by a Nahua elder and translated by a Spanish friar, a boy falls, ill after sleeping in a guest house where no blade had been placed. He dreams of falling into a well and wakes unable to speak. The healer, upon arriving, discovers that the house had once belonged to a family known for ignoring sleep rites. The boy recovers only after being moved, bathed in river water, and given a fresh obsidian shard to place beneath his tongue while he sleeps, a highly unusual, even risky practice. The ritual works, but the story remains a warning: never sleep unguarded. As colonization advanced, these beliefs came under attack. Spanish missionaries, seeing the blades beside beds and altars, associated them with devil worship. They confiscated many of the old tekpatl, melting down those with metal handles, discarding the glass ones as dangerous trash. But people remembered. Families hid their blades, claimed they were for preparing herbs or cutting cloth, and yet every night just before lying down, they placed them carefully by the eastern wall. We often ask, why hold on to such things? The blades didn't always work. The spirits still came. The dreams still frightened, but perhaps the act of placing the blade, of repeating the same words, of believing, even quietly, even alone, was enough. The Aztecs didn't expect perfect protection. They expected effort, ritual as responsibility. Sleep was not a break from life. It was part of the fight to live rightly, to be in balance, to remain connected to one's soul. And so they kept placing the knife, night after night, year after year, even after the empire fell, even after the gods were renamed, even after the language shifted, because at the end of every day, the question remained the same: what will come for me in the dark? And its quiet answer: let it come. I am not alone. In our final section of this story, we'll explore how this practice has lingered, what traces remain in modern homes, stories, and superstitions, where the blades have gone and what replaced them, because obsidian still exists, and dreams still arrive. The only question is what we place beside us while we sleep. In a small village house, centuries after the fall of the Aztec Empire, a woman wraps a smooth piece of black glass in a cloth the color of ash. She places it on a low shelf near where her child sleeps. She does not speak, she does not explain, but when asked, she says, "It keeps the bad away." She does not call it a tekpatl. She may not even know the word. But the act is older than memory. It is the continuation of something quiet, careful, and ancient. This is how the obsidian knife survived, not in glass cases or temples, not as a relic of war, but as a symbol of protection, an unbroken ritual carried forward not through empire or priesthood, but through family. After the Spanish conquest, as Aztec temples were razed and codices burned, many objects of spiritual use disappeared from public life. But some, like the tekpatl, were too personal to erase. They weren't public icons. They were private companions, often hidden, often misunderstood. And because of that, they remained. Archaeologists have uncovered obsidian blades tucked into household foundations, buried under sleeping platforms, or sealed in clay vessels. Some were clearly ceremonial, others, worn down, and dulled, suggest daily domestic use. Too old and sacred to be thrown away, yet no longer sharp enough to serve in the fields or kitchen. These finds suggest a story beyond warfare. A story of domestic continuity, of belief that moved inside when the outside world became dangerous. Even as Christianity spread, especially in rural and mountainous areas, many families continued placing dark stones or blades near beds. They no longer called them spirit protectors. They were now just in case, a family tradition, something their grandmother had done. It helps the dreams, they'd say. A 19th century ethnographer visiting Puebla recorded hearing about dream cutting, stones kept under pillows to stop night terrors. He dismissed the practice as nonsense. But what he didn't realize was that these were descendants of the Tecpatl, not just in material, but in meaning. The knife, by then, no longer needed to be literal. In some cases, it had been replaced with metal scissors, especially small pairs tied shut with red thread and tucked beneath a child's cradle. This, too, was said to cut bad dreams. In other homes, people placed knots of black wool near beds. When asked why, they replied, "It keeps sleep from unraveling." And in some of the most isolated communities, people still placed obsidian shards in clay bowls beside beds, sometimes covered with water, sometimes with salt. Few could explain why. But when pressed, someone always said, "To guard the place where the soul walks. The deeper we look, the more we see it." The blade beside the bed became a language of care, a belief not in brute force, but in quiet defense. In a world where so much was taken, land, gods, names, the Tecpatl remained not because it was hidden, but because it was woven into the night. The modern world is louder now. Our bedrooms glow with screens. Our dreams are filtered by noise. We rarely lie still long, enough to listen to the silence around us, but the vulnerability remains. Sleep is still surrender. The space between worlds, between memory and vision, between calm and fear, still opens every night, whether we recognize it or not. And so perhaps the question is not whether we should return to obsidian blades, or chant old prayers, or burn Gopal. Perhaps the question is simply, what do we place beside us when we sleep? A glass of water, a photograph, a light left on, a closed door, an object with no explanation, just a feeling that it helps. These too are rituals. Not unlike the Tecpatl, they mark a boundary, a small defiant claim. Here is my rest. Here I am watched. In that sense, the spirit of the Aztec blade lives on, not in its edge, but in its purpose. And while we may no longer name the demons of the night, or speak of Tonali slipping from our heads, or fear the Tsitsimime hovering between stars, we still dream, we still fear, we still protect. So tonight, when you lie down, think not only of the softness beneath you, but of the space around you, the air, the dark, the memories waiting at the edge of sleep, and ask yourself, what guards you when you close your eyes? At night in Tenochtitlan, the fires dimmed, and the sounds of the city softened into the hush of water lapping against the causeways. Somewhere in the shadows of that silence, Tezcatlipoca waited. You would not see him, not as you would see a carved idol or a painted wall. He did not stand still. He moved. He drifted in reflections, stepped silently in smoke, and appeared only when least expected. For the Aztecs, Tezcatlipoca was not just a god. He was a presence, a thought that watched you think, a whisper behind the dream. Tezcatlipoca, whose name means smoking mirror, was a deity of night, sorcery, fate, memory, conflict, and mystery. Unlike the sun god Huitzilopochtli, who required daylight and sacrifice to rise, Tezcatlipoca required nothing. He was already there, beneath your actions, within your doubts, inside your sleep. To dream of him was not considered unusual. It was expected, because that was where he did his best work. Unlike the gods who demanded rituals under open sky, Tezcatlipoca made himself known in dreams, in shifting forms. He might appear as a jaguar with burning eyes, or a feathered serpent whose mouth whispered your true name. Or most famously, as a black obsidian mirror floating in the air, never showing your face directly, but instead what lay beneath it. The priests taught that such dreams were not just personal. They were messages from fate. In a world where most people believed they were born into a path, farmer, warrior, priest, servant, Tezcatlipoca offered both danger and possibility. Because to dream of him was to be seen, not just your role but your hesitation, your hidden hunger, your guilt. And what he showed you might change everything. It might even destroy you. The observers of dreams, especially those trained in the Karmakak schools, kept close watch on dreams involving Tezcatlipoca. The signs were many: mirrors, smoke, limping animals. Tezcatlipoca was often depicted with one leg, or the sound of laughter behind a door that wouldn't open. If a young noble dreamed of such things, it was considered a test, not a punishment, but an opportunity, a chance to change one's path or fail to do so. Dreams of Tezcatlipoca were frequently recorded by the Tetlahuiloque, the dream watchers. One fragment preserved in the Codex Rios tells of a boy who dreamt of standing between two rivers. One was clear and gentle, the other violent and dark. The boy chose the violent one and was later chosen for the priesthood. The dream watcher wrote, "He chose the mirror, not the sky." Another tale, spoken aloud in the early post-conquest period and recorded by a Nahua elder, tells of a merchant who had a dream of being led through a market by a shadow. Each stall held his past mistakes, a missed promise, a cruel word, a stolen coin. When he awoke, he left the city and became a wandering storyteller. He claimed Tezcatlipoca had let him see the weight of his breath. These dreams were not comforting. Tezcatlipoca was never meant to comfort. He was not a god of peace. He was a god of reality, of confronting what you hide, of facing what you would rather not know. And because sleep is the one place where the self lets down its guard, that's where he waited. The obsidian mirrors used in temples were said to be his windows. Priests would gaze into them not to see visions, but to see themselves unguarded. This was dangerous work. Too long a gaze, it was said, and one might lose their mind, not from madness, but from clarity too pure to endure. But not only priests saw him. Ordinary people too told stories of strange dreams in which they heard their own thoughts spoken aloud by a voice behind them. They dreamed of forests that turned to ash mid-step, of doorways that led to rooms they didn't remember building, of fires that burned nothing but still gave off heat. In all such dreams, the lesson was the same. You are not only what you pretend to be, you are also what you fear to admit. Tezcatlipoca didn't demand worship through sacrifice alone. He demanded honesty, and that was far more difficult. This made him a paradox, a terrifying god, but also a necessary one. The Aztecs lived in a world of order, calendars, tribute, rank, structure. Tezcatlipoca offered a break in that pattern, not through chaos, but through revelation. His dream whispers asked, "What if your path isn't right? What if your mask is slipping? What if you are meant for more or less than what you believe?" Sometimes these dreams led to greatness. A young soldier, haunted by dreams of his own death, might withdraw from battle and become a poet. Her healer, shown visions of a bleeding son, might change her treatments, saving lives in the process. These weren't hallucinations. They were seen as gifts. Difficult gifts, dangerous gifts, but gifts nonetheless. And yet, to dream of Tezcatlipoca too often was not always seen as a blessing. Those marked by his presence were considered touched by restlessness, by insight that could isolate. They were often mistrusted, envied, or quietly feared, and so many who dreamed of him said nothing. They carried his symbols quietly, an obsidian bead sewn into clothing, a whispered chant before sleep, a finger traced on a mirror, but only at night. His priests said that he was always near but never known, that he could not be invoked. He could only notice you, and when he did, he would leave a dream in your mind like a black feather on white stone, visible, silent, and heavy with meaning. In the next part of this story, we'll explore how the priests of Tezcatlipoca trained to interpret these dreams, how they walked between fear and wisdom, and how even the emperor himself feared dreaming too deeply of the smoking mirror, because Tezcatlipoca didn't shout. He whispered, and it was enough. In the city of Tenochtitlan, the temples were many, but none whispered like the house of Tezcatlipoca. Itai wasn't the tallest. It didn't thunder with drums. There were no flaming braziers lining its steps. Instead, it sat in a quiet part of the sacred precinct, shrouded in shadow, its stonework darker than the others, adorned not with gold, but with mirrors. Small discs of polished obsidian set into the walls, arranged like watchful eyes. There, The priests of Tezcatlipoca were trained, not to preach but to observe, not to call down power but to recognize it when it arrived, in dreams. These priests were known as the Titlacahuan Mimani, those who serve the one we belong to. It was a name born of paradox. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was not a god who belonged to anyone. Instead, you belonged to him, if he chose to notice you. Training for these priests began in youth, often before the child knew they were chosen. A dream would mark them, a quiet one, a strange one, a vision that lingered. A priest would come to the family home, speak to the parents and take the child to begin instruction. No cries of celebration, no festive procession, just the sound of sandals on stone as the child vanished into silence. Their training was unlike that of other clergy. While the priests of Huitzilopochtli practiced war songs and sacrifice rituals, and those of Tlaloc studied water signs and storm cycles, the followers of Tezcatlipoca were taught to wait, to sit in the dark, to listen to dreams told by others, and to say nothing for a long time, because interpretation, they were told, was not decoding. It was witnessing. Tezcatlipoca's dreams were never direct. A man might dream of a jaguar devouring its own tail, or of a mirror shattering and the shards spelling out words he couldn't read, or of a familiar face speaking with a stranger's voice. The priests didn't offer answers. They asked more questions. Where were you standing in the dream? What direction did the smoke move? Did the shadow pass in front of or behind you? Each answer was written down, on bark, on cloth, sometimes even in dust, because for the smoking mirror, meaning arrived gradually, not all at once. These priests also learned to recognize the tone of a dream, whether it arrived with fear, shame, pride, longing. This emotion mattered as much as the content. A dream of fire could mean 10 different things, but if it came with joy, it might be about renewal. If it came with sorrow, it might be a warning. The most skilled among them were called mirror bearers, not just because they carried small obsidian discs, but because they were believed to reflect the truth back to others. These priests sometimes acted as advisors to rulers, but they were rarely embraced with warmth. Their presence made people uneasy, because when you stood before a mirror bearer, you didn't know what version of yourself they might see, and what if they saw something you had buried. It is said that Emperor Moctezuma II kept who he was. Tezcatlipoca, or fate itself, is unclear, but it's telling that even as the empire trembled, the voice behind the mirror continued to whisper, not to offer salvation, not to promise victory, but to show what was, because Tezcatlipoca, above all else, was a god of truth without comfort, and the priests who served him had one sacred task, to listen without blinking. This took a toll. Some mirror-bearers went blind in later years, not from age, but, it was said, from seeing too much. Others became mute, speaking only through gestures. Some disappeared entirely, walking into the forests or the hills, believing they had already seen their end and had nothing more to say. But despite the burden, they were respected, not liked. Not celebrated, but respected. Because when the moment came when a person stood at a crossroads of fate, they often sought the one who had watched the mirrors, not to ask, what should I do? But to ask, what do I already know but refuse to see? This is what Tezcatlipoca gave, the chance to confront yourself, alone, in the dark, without flattery, without lies. Even now, echoes of these teachings linger, in dreams where you face yourself. In moments when something in you whispers that you are not being honest, in the pull of memory that reveals not just events, but meaning. Some might call it conscience. The Aztecs would call it the god who speaks without raising his voice. In the final section of this story, we'll follow how Tezcatlipoca's presence endured after the conquest, how his voice was silenced but not forgotten, and how the smoking mirror still appears now and then behind closed eyes. After the temples crumbled and the gods were renamed, after the chants fell silent and the altars were buried under cathedrals, so there were those who still dreamed of mirrors that smoked. They no longer said the name Tezcatlipoca aloud. That was dangerous. That was heresy. But in dark rooms before sleep, a few still whispered prayers, not to saints, not to the new heaven, but to something that had never needed a name to begin with, because Tezcatlipoca had never needed temples to exist. He had always lived in the space behind your thoughts, in the image you tried not to see, in the hesitation between action and doubt, and in dreams he remained. The colonizers dismissed him as a devil. They said that anyone who claimed to hear voices in dreams was touched by evil, or madness, or worse. But even as friars preached of sin and salvation, villagers continued to wake in the night, troubled by dreams that showed them things they could not explain. An old woman sees herself at a crossroads with a mirror in place of a heart. A young man dreams of being followed by a figure who wears his own face. A child wakes crying, saying that a voice with no mouth told me the truth. None of these dreamers say his name, but they know the smoking mirror remains, in some Nahua. Communities, long after the conquest, fragments of his worship persisted, not in open ritual but in subtle signs. Mirrors were covered at night. Children were taught not to gaze too long at still water. If someone dreamed of teeth falling or of walking in smoke, the elders said, "Pay attention. A change is coming." In small ways, the interpretive instincts of Tezcatlipoca's priests survived, hidden beneath new stories, absorbed into folk Catholicism, disguised as superstition. A broken mirror was bad luck. A dream of yourself in third person was an omen. A voice in a dream that spoke your name meant that someone somewhere was remembering you with longing or with danger. Even obsidian itself retained its mystery. While no longer placed in temples, it was still used in healing, protection, and sleep rituals. A fragment placed under the bed was said to keep the soul from wandering too far. A small disc kept in the home was believed to deflect envy and lies. These were not labeled as Aztec practices anymore. They were simply the old ways, and sometimes they worked. One healer, writing in the 1800s, described a patient who suffered nightmares, visions of burning fields and collapsing towers. He gave her a polished stone and told her to place it beside her bed. The dreams stopped. When asked what the stone was, he said, "A black mirror. It reminds the night to behave." He didn't say Tezcatlipoca, but the mirror remembered. The memory of Tezcatlipoca didn't need form to endure. He had never been a god of spectacle. His power lay in what went unsaid, in the quiet knowledge that you had something left unresolved, something hidden, something avoided. And even today that knowledge persists when you wake from a dream that seems to know you better than you know yourself, when you feel the weight of a thought you can't explain, when you look into a mirror and feel for just a moment that something is looking back. That's him, not in anger, not in judgment, but in invitation. Because Tezcatlipoca was not simply a god of fear, he was a god of choice. He didn't punish weakness, he revealed it. He didn't demand obedience, he asked for honesty. He is the reminder that beneath every version of yourself you show the world, there is another. One who remembers the truth, one who carries the questions, one who still listens for the quiet whisper in the dark. And so the smoking mirror has never really left. It lingers in our symbols, in our silences, in the dreams that dare to tell us something we're not ready to hear. It does not shout, it does not glow. It simply waits. And when the time is right, when the self is quiet and the soul is unguarded, it speaks. Not with words, but with truth. It's just after midnight in Tenochtitlan, and the lake is still. A chill mist hangs over the canals. Reed mats rustle softly in sleeping homes. And above, hidden behind thick clouds, the stars are silent. But no one dares to say the word drought yet. Instead, they listen, not to thunder but to breathing, not to clouds but to dreams. Because in the Aztec world, when rain failed to come, the gods were not blamed first. The people's dreams were, and the god who watched those dreams most closely was Tlaloc, the deity of rain, fertility, springs, and storms. Tlaloc was not a gentle rain god. His image, goggled eyes, fanged mouth, serpent crown, suggested something far more volatile. He could nourish or destroy. He brought crops or floods. He was not appeased by kindness, but by attention. And so the Aztecs developed not only ceremonies and sacrifices for Tlaloc, but an entire system of sleep rituals designed to observe, guide, and even influence the rains through dreams. These were, known loosely as Tlanamictalistli, dream unions with the rain god. They were performed in anticipation of planting, during long dry spells, and especially before the Atlacualo festival, the first month of the Aztec calendar, dedicated entirely to water and purification. Here's how it worked. Certain families, especially those who lived near lakes or springs, were chosen as dream receivers. They weren't priests, but they had a reputation. Their children or elders often dreamed of weather, animals, or floods. These dreamers would be guided by a community tisitl, a spiritual healer, to prepare for a special night of rest. First, they would fast from salt and chili, known to spice the mind too sharply. Then, they would bathe in cool river, water invoking Tlaloc's favor through cleanliness. A circle of wet leaves would be placed under their mats to invite the god's attention. The dreamers would then lie down, not to sleep alone, but under watch. Herr Tetlatzhuilotl, dream scribe, would sit nearby listening for murmurs, movements, or signs. At dawn, the dreamer would be asked to speak, and everything, every symbol, no matter how strange, would be recorded. A dream of frogs croaking in a dry forest might mean rain would come late. A vision of thunder without clouds could mean flooding. Seeing Tlaloc himself, rare but reported, was considered a sign of either great blessing or coming disaster. The most desired dream was simple: rain falling gently on maize plants. It meant harmony, that the god was pleased, that the lake would rise on time, that life would continue. But such dreams could not be summoned by will. They required balance. It was said that if a dreamer approached the ritual with fear, the dream would be dry. If they approached with arrogance, the dream would flood. The dreamer had to lie down as an empty sky, open, clear, expectant. Children were considered the purest dreamers of all. During certain festivals, boys and girls between ages 5 and 7 would be selected to participate in rain dream ceremonies. The night before the festival, they would sleep in a sacred enclosure filled with flowering plants and ceramic frogs, Tlaloc's sacred animals. Their dreams were believed to reflect the god's current mood. One account from the Florentine Codex tells of a boy who awoke saying he had dreamed of birds flying backward into the sun. The priests took this as a warning, and the upcoming ceremony was altered. The rain came 2 days later, hard, fast, and just in time. To modern ears, this might sound like superstition, but for the Aztecs, dreams were not guesses. They were part of observation. Just as one watched the skies, measured the soil, and timed the planting, one also listened to the dreams of those whose spirits were attuned to Tlaloc's voice, and his voice was rarely soft. Tlaloc appeared in dreams not as a man, but as storm-made shape. Some described him as a figure of mist. Others saw eyes glowing through rain. A few saw water itself speaking, rivers flowing backward, mouths made of fog. And while some gods whispered in riddles, Tlaloc showed consequences. A farmer might dream of maize rotting in the field. A fisherman might see nets filled with bones. Her mother might dream of washing a child only for the water to boil. These were not punishments, but messages, warnings, corrections, calls for offering. When a dreamer received such visions, the community responded. It wasn't treated as a private fear, it was shared. Rituals were held, fires were lit, children were bathed in river water, maize was offered to lakes. And if the rain came, it was said not that Tlaloc had been pleased, but that he had been heard. This distinction mattered. Tlaloc did not demand perfection. He demanded attention. The dream rituals around Tlaloc were not meant to manipulate him, but to stay in relationship with him. a kind of ongoing dialogue that required humility, vigilance, and memory. But what happened when the dreams failed? What if no one dreamed? What if Tlaloc went silent? These were the most terrifying nights of all, not the ones filled with floods or warnings, but the ones filled with nothing. Silence to the Aztecs was not peace. It was a sign that the balance had been broken so completely that even the gods had turned their backs. In the next part of this story, we'll explore what the Aztecs did when Tlaloc stopped speaking, the drought years, the dreams that turned into nightmares, the desperate rituals that followed when the sky stayed dry, because to the Aztecs, the greatest fear was not thunder, it was the absence of dreams. For a civilization built on floating, Garden's water was not just sustenance, it was identity. The Aztecs had mastered irrigation, canals, and chinampas, rectangular plots of fertile land built atop lakes, but no amount of engineering could outsmart the sky. When the rains failed, and Tlaloc did not speak through dream or omen, panic seeped into every corner of life, and worse than thunder or floods was the silence that followed sleep. Dreams, which had once bloomed with clouds and frogs and gentle mist, became barren. It was during these stretches, known later in the chronicles as the years of empty sky, that even the seasoned dream watchers grew uneasy. No images, no symbols, no visitations from Tlaloc. At first it was dismissed. Perhaps the dreamers were tired, or too full from feast. Maybe the gods were waiting for the right moment. But as the nights passed, 12, then 13, then a full lunar cycle, with no meaningful dreams, concern became alarm. The priests of Tlaloc responded with protocol. Special sleep ceremonies were held. Dreamers were bathed in ice-fed springs. They were forbidden to speak for a full day before sleeping. Entire families gathered to watch for signs, shivers in sleep, whispered words, even unusual eye movement. Nothing. And outside, the lake levels dropped. When the chinampas began to dry, at the roots the atonement phase began. This was a time of intense ritual. But what most never knew was that the first phase of atonement took place in sleep. The community's dreamers, often the children and elders with the clearest spiritual vision, were taken to a sacred site known as Tlalocanapan, or threshold, to Tlalocan. This was not the mythic paradise of Tlalocan itself, but a physical location, a spring cave lined with carved frog figures deep in the hills east of Lake Texcoco. There, they were made to sleep for 3 nights after fasting and ritual cleansing. It was believed that this sacred silence, in a space resonant with the god's energy, might reopen the closed pathway between mortals and the rain deity. What they hoped to receive was not prophecy, but reconnection. Some dreamers would return, claiming to have seen dripping walls. A few saw giant eyes watching them. One dreamt of drinking dry sand, only for it to turn into cool water before he awoke. That dream was interpreted as a turning point, but more often than not, these dreams remained unclear. This was when desperation began. The priests returned to more public rituals, offerings, sacrifices, chants, and even the most painful of ceremonies, the weeping of the children. During the festival of Atlacualo, children were chosen for sacrifice, not because they were unworthy, but because they were believed to be closest to Tlaloc's ears. Their tears, it was said, turned to rain in the god's hands. But what many forget is this. Before they were taken to the altar, those children were asked about their dreams. One priest wrote in the Codex Magliabeciano, "The children chosen were not those who cried the loudest, but those who dreamed of rivers." Even in sacrifice, dreams were the measure of connection. If a child had dreamed of waterfalls or swimming in flooded temples, it was seen as confirmation Tlaloc had accepted them. If they dreamed of dryness, the ritual was delayed. This detail, often omitted in retellings, reveals something quiet and solemn about Aztec belief, that a dream was a kind of consent, a conversation between soul and deity. And in the worst of droughts, that conversation had to continue, even at great cost. Not all dreams were accepted at face value. Sometimes false dreams emerged, visions interpreted in error, leading to failed rituals or misplaced hope. In one famous case, a young noblewoman claimed to dream of Tlaloc dancing beside the lake, singing songs of maize. The priests celebrated. Offerings were prepared. But the rain did not come. Later, it was discovered she had recited the dream from an old chant she had memorized. She wasn't punished, but she was mourned. Because to speak a dream that was not truly yours was considered a fracture in the rain world, an act of spiritual pollution. After such incidents, families became cautious. Dream watchers became even more exacting. Dream silence was seen as better than misinterpretation. But even in the drought years, some families kept faith. They placed bowls of water near beds. They lit blue candles for Tlaloc, the color of his robe and tears. Children were encouraged to describe even the smallest details: a puddle, a dripping leaf, a boat too heavy with water. Every image was written down, examined, read aloud to the gods, and slowly the dreams began to return. One boy, age 8, dreamt of a snake shedding its skin on a mountaintop. The next week, a small spring re-emerged near the far edge of the lake. A woman dreamt of a cloud coughing smoke, and within days distant thunder rolled across the horizon. Bit by bit, the silence broke. The rain that year came late, but it came, and as it fell, soaking the maize roots and singing in the canals, the people gave thanks, not just in temples, but in dreams. Because Tlaloc, for all his wrath and distance, had returned not through fire or sky, but through sleep. The Aztecs did not see this as magic. They saw it as relationship restored. In the final section of this story, we'll explore how dream listening for Tlaloc survived conquest. How the children of farmers and fishermen continued to watch the clouds in their sleep, and how rain rituals moved from temples to households where the gods could still be heard in the hush between thunderclaps, because Tlaloc may be fierce, but he never forgets the ones who dream of water. After conquest swept across the Valley of Mexico and the old gods were driven underground, the rain still came, the rivers still rose. The maize still grew, the people still watched the skies, and quietly, almost invisibly, they kept dreaming of Tlaloc. They no longer said his name in public. In churches, the children were told to pray to St. John for rain, to bow before statues imported from Spain. But in their homes, tucked between adobe walls and bundles of dried maize, old ways endured in whispers. A mother would wake her son and ask, as her grandmother once had, "Did you see clouds in your dream?" If the answer was yes, she would smile and hum a song too old for records. If the answer was no, she would quietly light a candle, set out a bowl of water, and sprinkle a few drops near the sleeping mat. These were no longer called rituals. They were simply habits, but their origins were clear. In the early colonial period, Spanish friars expressed frustration at what they called idolatrous dreaming. They noted with unease how indigenous people continued to treat dreams of water as signs. One friar in the 1570s wrote, "They say the children who dream of storms can call the clouds with a sigh." He dismissed it, but he didn't stop it, because how do you outlaw a dream? Obsidian mirrors had been shattered, codices burned, temples dismantled stone by stone. But the practice of listening to a sleeping child's murmurs, of recording a dream, about fish, about thunder, about rising lakes, that survived. Tlaloc's memory moved into household practice. Instead of sacred caves, families slept near cisterns or water jars, believing the presence of water invited better dreams. Instead of public rituals, they held private moments, washing children's feet with herbs after nightmares, listening carefully to anyone who said they saw a frog in their sleep, and always they watched the sky. In villages across central Mexico, elders began to create their own dream calendars, not written down but remembered across seasons. A dream of a single raindrop. Rain in 9 days. A dream of lightning behind a closed door. Rain will strike suddenly. A dream of walking in dry riverbeds while holding a candle. Prepare for crop loss unless a ritual is offered. These interpretations varied by region and lineage, but the structure, the idea that dreams were weather, remained unchanged, and the dreams kept guiding them. In the 18th century, a Nahua farmer's diary was discovered near the edge of a spring-fed chinampa field. Though faded, a few entries remain legible. One reads, "Lucia dreamed of a turtle hiding beneath a lily. The sky was blue all morning. Rain came before dusk." Another reads, "My son dreamed of washing his feet with thunder. We planted early. The gods were kind." No mention of Tlaloc, no mention of altars. But there in the margins you see it, the belief that dreams and water still spoke to each other. Today, if you walk through parts of Puebla, Tlaxcala, or rural Morelos, you may hear an old saying, "If a child dreams of frogs, don't cover the roof. It means let the rain in, it's coming soon." The person who says this may not think of Tlaloc. They may not know the name at all. But they are participating in something ancient, a thread that connects present to past through sleep. In more recent times, artists and poets have returned to Tlaloc. His image appears in murals, in songs, in literature, sometimes fierce, sometimes soft, but always near water, always watching, always waiting to be remembered, not through temples or thunder, but through the small symbolic things people still do, placing water under the bed, asking children about their dreams, smiling when a storm is predicted by sleep. Tlaloc, it seems, does not need to be prayed to. He just needs to be heard, and he is. In the dark moments before the rain, in the quiet between thunderclaps, in the trembling voice of someone who says, half asleep, "I saw the clouds again." To the Aztecs, this was not coincidence. It was relationship, and it endures. So tonight, if you hear rain against the window, if you wake from a dream of overflowing wells or frogs hiding in your room, know this: the god may be silent, but he is still near. He speaks in dreams and listens in water. In the final years before the Spaniards arrived, the nights in Tenochtitlan were heavy with silence. The city, once buzzing with ritual and song, seemed to hold its breath. The canals still flowed. The chinampas still bloomed. But in the palace, among the columns of obsidian and the walls painted with history, something had changed. The emperor had begun to dream of stars. Moctezuma II, Tlatoani of the Mexica, was not a man easily shaken. He had overseen a mighty empire, guided rituals, judged disputes, and spoken for the gods. But in his final years, he was haunted not by enemies from outside, but by visions that arrived only when his eyes were closed. The court whispered about, servants heard him pacing long before dawn. Priests were summoned at strange hours. Pages noted entire nights when the palace torches were kept burning. But Moctezuma himself said little. Instead, he began requesting that his dreams be recorded. It was a custom rarely used by rulers. While the nobility respected dreams, they did not always share them. To dream was to risk being known, and for a ruler, privacy was power. But something about these dreams disturbed Moctezuma deeply, and so a quiet order was given. 3 Tetlashuiloque, the dream scribes, were to stay within the palace. Not in chambers of gold or jade, but in simple reed-matted quarters, near enough to be summoned each morning. Their task was delicate: record only what was said by the emperor. Ask no questions. Offer no interpretations unless asked. And above all, never repeat the dreams outside the palace walls. The first dream came during the dry season. Moctezuma reported walking through a city made of mirrors. The sky was full of stars, but they were wrong, moving too quickly, falling like rain. As he walked, his reflection appeared in every surface, but it changed with each step. A child, a soldier, a corpse, a priest. He awoke, trembling. The scribes wrote the dream in quiet shorthand, then copied it in full on amatl bark paper. The record was sealed and placed within a ceremonial bundle wrapped in blue cloth, the color of both sky and fate. The second dream came 3 nights later. This time, Moctezuma stood on a vast hill, watching the stars fall into the lake. But they didn't vanish. They became men, pale men, with iron mouths and burning hands. He tried to speak, but no sound came. Then a voice behind him said, "You are dreaming what has already happened." Again he awoke before dawn. And again the scribes wrote in silence. By the fifth dream, the court had begun to worry. The emperor's behavior changed. He stopped eating with others. He delayed ceremonies. He requested that all star maps be brought to his quarters, including those used by the Tonalpulque, the sacred calendar priests. He studied them not with wonder but with fear, because the stars in his dreams no longer obeyed the sky. They spun backward, collided, disappeared mid-blink. This was especially troubling because in Aztec belief, the stars were more than decoration. They were ancestors, warriors, and warnings. The movement of the stars was thought to echo the movement of fate. And a star out of place? That was a message. One dream showed the constellation Citlalicu, the Lady of the Star Skirt, weeping black, water that turned into blades. Another revealed the Milky Way twisting into a serpent and swallowing the moon. The priests tried to interpret. Some said it meant drought. Others suggested rebellion. A few, braver than most, hinted at the end of an era, not in war, but in meaning. That Moctezuma's dreams were not his alone, but reflections of a dying calendar. Still, the emperor did not speak publicly about them, but his actions told the story. He changed his sleeping chambers, moving to a smaller, windowless room in the back of the palace, lit by a single lamp. He ordered a new obsidian mirror placed beside his mat. He stopped wearing feathered headdresses, saying the wind carried too much sound, and he began sleeping surrounded by silence. Only his dream scribes remained, dutiful and mute. They never interpreted aloud. But among themselves, it said they began to write in margins, notes of concern, of pattern, of warning, because the dreams over time were not just strange. They were recurring. Moctezuma saw the same figures again and again, the stars falling into men, the lake boiling with light. His voice silenced, the same voice whispering behind him, "This has already happened." No one in the empire knew what to make of it. And yet, beyond the palace, the winds began to shift. Reports came of strangers on the coast, ships larger than temples, bearded men who did not speak Nahuatl. Moctezuma listened. He said little. But in his chambers he unrolled the dream records and began to weep. He recognized the shapes. He said, "I have seen them before, in sleep." In the next section, we'll explore what happened when Moctezuma tried to act on his dreams, and how the people around him responded, how the line between prophecy, fear, and leadership blurred, and how a ruler paralyzed by vision began to prepare for an end no one yet understood. Because sometimes the stars don't guide. Sometimes they fall. Each night, the Emperor Moctezuma lay down in a small darkened room within his palace, surrounded not by generals or advisors, but by silence. One obsidian mirror to his right, a bowl of river water to his left, and 3 dream scribes seated in the hallway waiting, listening for his voice at dawn. Each morning the record grew longer. The stars in his sleep kept behaving unnaturally. They fell sideways. They sang without sound. They blinked in and out like heartbeats. And always, always they turned into men, not Mexica, not warriors of Tlaloc or Huitzilopochtli. These were pale-skinned men, bearded in strange armor, with glowing hands and mouths that spat lightning. Moctezuma began referring to them not as soldiers, but as stars turned backward. He said, "They are made of sky and salt. They belong to a god we cannot see." When his advisors asked what should be done, whether to send warriors to the coast or messengers or tribute, Moctezuma hesitated, not out of weakness, but because the dreams had begun to deliver something more dangerous than fear. Doubt. Was this the return of Quetzalcoatl, as some whispered? Was it the end of the 5th sun? Was this a punishment from the gods, or a test? And if it was a test, what was the right answer? The emperor began seeking out the oldest dreamers, not the priests of war, but the quiet watchers of sleep. He met with herbalists, midwives, even retired scribes known for interpreting dreams. In the countryside, he asked them about stars, about silence, about strangers, Most said little. A few cried. One told him, "This is not a dream of a man. It is a dream of time." Moctezuma's behavior grew more ritualistic. He fasted longer. He refused to eat maize unless it had been soaked in spring water. He stopped touching jade or gold, claiming their weight disrupted his dreams. And most unsettling of all, he ordered that his dream scrolls be buried. The scribes protested. They had written each dream with care, they had tracked symbols, they had found patterns. But the emperor insisted, "These dreams are not to be read. They are to be obeyed." And so, wrapped in maguey fiber, the scrolls were placed inside a sealed clay urn, buried beneath a garden of blue flowers in the palace courtyard. No marker, no blessing, just a single obsidian shard pressed into the earth above. From that day on, Moctezuma stopped speaking about his dreams, but they didn't stop. Witnesses said he often woke screaming, drenched in sweat, that he sometimes stared at the stars without blinking, murmuring names no one understood. And though he continued to lead ceremonies, his voice changed, slower, softer, as if listening to something only he could hear. When the Spaniards arrived, the emperor already knew. He welcomed them with courtesy, with caution, with eyes heavy from too many sleepless nights. He gifted them gold, listened to their strange tongues, let them walk his streets. But all the while, he watched their movements with the same stillness with which he had watched his dreams. He whispered to his scribes, "They are like stars, bright, cold, distant." His generals begged him to act, his warriors prepared. But Moctezuma hesitated, because what if this had already happened? What if this was the dream becoming real? There is a quiet tragedy in his indecision, not cowardice, not ignorance, but the unbearable weight of vision, the burden of having seen too much. For years the stars had shown him what was coming, and now that it had arrived, he didn't know if changing it was still possible. Some elders believed the dreams had been warnings meant to help him prepare. Others believed they had been seals, symbols that could not be broken. And a few thought the dreams themselves were the end, and what followed was only echo. One dream recorded in a surviving fragment read, "The stars gather above the mountain. They sing in silver. Then without reason they fall. I open my mouth to warn them, but my voice returns only as rain." In the final weeks before his capture, Moctezuma slept less and less. He wandered the palace at night, stood in doorways, touched the cold stone walls as if searching for something hidden beneath them. One servant later said, he did not fear death, he feared waking up in the wrong world. That line, passed from mouth to mouth, outlived the empire. After Moctezuma's death, unclear even today whether by Spanish hands or the fury of his own people, the palace fell quiet. The scribes scattered. The dream scrolls were lost. But the dreams, they remained. Long after, people claimed to see the emperor in their sleep, standing under stars that wept, pointing to the sky and saying nothing, or whispering the same sentence. Over and over, this was the only ending. In the final section of this story, we'll explore what Moctezuma's dreams came to represent in the generations after conquest. How they were retold, not as history, but as a lesson in vision, silence and the limits of knowing, because some dreams warn us, some try to change us, and some only ask that we listen even if we cannot act. The Aztec Empire fell, its temples were broken, its gods renamed, its calendars burned. But Moctezuma's dreams, those stayed, not as written records. The scrolls were gone, buried, destroyed, or simply forgotten. But his visions survived in voice, passed through generations as quiet stories, told beside cooking fires or whispered to children watching stars at night. He dreamed the stars fell. He dreamed strangers became smoke. He saw everything. And still it happened. In these retellings, Moctezuma became something more than an emperor. He became a symbol of what it means to see, but not to stop. A man whose mind reached too far into the sky, only to find that the future would not bend for him. And yet the dream itself was never mocked. Even those who blamed Moctezuma for failing to fight, for hesitating too long, never dismissed the dreams. Because somewhere deep down people knew. He had seen the truth. Across colonial Mexico, new rulers came and new gods were taught. But among the descendants of the Mexica, stories of Moctezuma's sleep remained. Not grand stories, just quiet images. The emperor walking beneath a sky that refused to hold still. The emperor holding a broken star in his hand. The emperor looking into a mirror that showed no reflection. Some families said they too had inherited such dreams. A fisherman near Lake Texcoco once claimed that his father would wake years after conquest, saying, "The emperor is still dreaming, and we are part of it." A woman in the mountains of Guerrero passed down a story to her daughters about a voice that comes at night and says, "It isn't over. The stars remember you." Even now, the symbolism of Moctezuma's dreams appears in Mexican literature, paintings, and poetry, not always by name but in form. A sky spinning the wrong way, a leader too full of vision to move, a silence louder than drums. He represents the moment when knowing doesn't guarantee control, the moment when a person realizes that fate, no matter how clearly seen, may not be averted, only witnessed. This became his legacy, not the gold he gave to Cortés, not the throne, not the empire, but the question he left behind. If we dream of disaster and fail to stop it, is the dream still worth having? Some said yes, because to see the truth, even if it cannot be changed, is better than to be blind to it. Others said no, that his dreams weakened him, that they pulled him into hesitation, isolation, and surrender. But most said nothing. They simply lit candles, watched the stars. And when a strange dream came, they remembered him, not with fear, not with blame, but with a kind of reverence. A man who carried too many symbols, a mirror that cracked before he could speak. And so tonight, if you dream of stars falling where they shouldn't, if you wake with the feeling that something has already happened, if you hear a voice in sleep saying, "This was the only ending," you are not alone. You are dreaming with Moctezuma, not the emperor, the man, the watcher, the one who saw the sky bend and did not look away. In the Valley of Mexico, when the rains softened the soil and the days grew short, the Xochitl bloomed. Not the delicate spring blossoms or the edible flowers of feast days. This flower came later, near the end of the cycle, just as the winds turned cold and the nights grew longer. It was orange. It was gold, and it had a name that meant many things. Cempasúchil to some, flower of the dead to others. But to the dream watchers, it was something else. It was the flower that visited the sleeping. While most people know the cempasúchil as the flower laid out for Dia de los Muertos, pathways of petals leading the spirits home, that tradition has roots far deeper, in the days before conquest, in stories and rituals where the flower didn't just honor the dead, it carried messages from them. The Aztecs believed that dreams involving the Xochitl flower were unlike any others. They did not come from the gods, from omens, or from fate. They came from those who had passed on, friends, ancestors, lovers. And these dreams were not haunting, they were visits, and they almost always involved flowers that moved, petals that whispered, blooms that floated on water, gardens that grew around the sleeper's body, holding them gently. A woman might dream of her grandmother weaving marigold petals into her hair, warning her not to marry too soon. A child might see their late father planting glowing orange flowers in the courtyard, saying, "Don't be afraid of where I've gone." So a healer, nearing the end of her life, might dream of a long path lined with blossoms, each one a soul she had helped. She would walk it slowly, pausing at each bloom, remembering a name. These dreams were not interpreted the way others were. They were not for reading, they were for feeling. The midwives and dream watchers taught that if a Xochitl appeared in your dream, you must not try to pull it apart or ask what it meant. You must simply follow where it led. This was rare among Aztec dream traditions, which typically emphasized symbol decoding, matching elements to calendars, deities, omens. But Xochitl dreams, these were personal, private, sacred. They were called Xochicoyotl, dreams of blooming memory. Certain dreamers were known for having these visions often. They were not priests or elites. Usually they were ordinary people, a weaver who had lost her brother, a boy whose mother had died in childbirth, an old man whose wife had passed during the dry season. They didn't seek the dreams, but the flowers came to them anyway. The Aztecs believed this happened because grief itself was a kind of soil, and when it was tended with love and time, flowers grew from it, even in sleep. There was a saying among the Tisitl, "A heart too full will bloom where no sun shines." In other words, in the darkness of loss, a soul may still be visited by beauty. These dreams were never feared, even when they made the sleeper weep upon waking, even when they showed things the heart wasn't ready to see. Because to dream of Cempasúchil was to be reminded that death wasn't distance. It was just another garden, one we didn't live in, but could sometimes walk through in sleep. These dreams often came during Michaelwitontli, the festival of the little dead dedicated to children who had passed. Families would decorate their homes with garlands of marigold, not only for the altars but for the beds. Small blossoms were tucked into pillows, woven into blankets, placed under the mats of children. The hope was simple, that in sleep, the children might see their siblings again, or their grandparents, or the pets who had walked with them by the lake, and often they did. One fragment from the Codex Tudela mentions a child who woke saying, "She came in the night. She was holding flowers in her mouth. She gave one to me and said I had grown taller." The family wept, not out of sorrow but relief, because that dream meant something survived, not just memory, but connection. In the next section, we'll explore the rituals built around Xochitl dreams, how they were invited, honored, and passed down. We'll see how marigold became more than a symbol of death, and how sleep in the Aztec world was not escape, but reunion. Because for the Mexica, flowers did not die. They bloomed where we could not follow, until we closed our eyes. In the Aztec world, death was not a wall, it was a door. And dreams, especially those filled with Xochitl, the golden marigold, were the key. When someone passed on, there were ceremonies, offerings, tears. But in the days and weeks after, what people waited for most was the dream. Not everyone received one. But when it came, when the petals bloomed in sleep, it meant the soul had found its way, that they remembered you, that they were still walking beside you, in a garden you could only visit when your eyes were closed. This belief, deeply woven into the Mexica understanding of the soul, shaped how they grieved, because death for them wasn't finality. It was movement, a shift in where the soul lived, and flowers, especially the Cempasúchil, were more than symbols, they were messengers, not just offered to the dead, but offered by them in dreams. You might think of grief as silence, but the Aztecs saw it as a language waiting to bloom. When a family lost someone, they didn't just build altars. They made space for dreams. The mat would be laid clean, a flower placed beneath, a bowl of water set nearby to hold the reflection of the visitor. And if the dream came, it was welcomed, not feared. Some families held a custom called Xochicuicatl, the flower singing. If someone dreamt of a loved one bringing marigolds, the household would rise early and sing a soft song at dawn, offering thanks. The words varied by region, but always included some form of, "You bloomed again for me, I carry your petals into waking." It was not performance, it was memory, spoken aloud. These songs were never recorded, but they lived on in voices, in humming, in fragments that danced through generations like falling blossoms, and the dreams kept coming. A merchant, grieving his lost brother, dreamt of petals blowing across the market square, each one speaking a word of encouragement. A young girl, never having met her grandfather, dreamt of him weaving marigold garlands at the edge of a river. When she awoke, she asked her mother what kind of flower he used to grow. The mother wept, because it was true. The flower had become proof of love that lingered. Even when the Spanish arrived, even when they tore down temples and rewrote the stories, they couldn't stop the dreams. Instead, they watched as marigold spread not just through festivals, but through the dreams of those they sought to convert. They called it folklore, superstition. Yet they too began to use the flower during All Saints' Day. They could not deny its power, because when enough people dream of the same bloom, it becomes something more than a flower. It becomes a memory that refuses to be erased. To this day, The cempasúchil continues to mark the line between life and death in Mexican culture. Its scent, its color, its soft fall across gravestones and altars. But for those who remember, it also marks something else. The dream that still carries messages. Ask anyone who has lost someone close. Ask if they've ever seen them in a dream. Not as ghosts, not as fears, but simply present, wearing familiar clothes, holding something, smiling, or often offering a flower. It is a soft language, one with no grammar, no need for translation, because the dream is not about saying goodbye. It's about remembering that goodbye was never the end. The Aztecs understood this better than most. They built no monuments for the Xochitl dreamers, no pyramids, no records. They simply said, if you are missing someone, let the flower speak. If you cannot sleep, let the flower guide. And if you wake with petals in your heart, carry them gently into the day. And so, we end not with ceremony, but with a question that still echoes across centuries. Who do you hope visits you when the flower blooms next? Before there were doctors in white coats, before medicine came in glass bottles or sterile rooms, there were the Ticitl, the healer priests of the Aztec world. They worked with herbs and chants, pressure and prayer. They studied the wind, the pulse, the color of the tongue. They carried memory in bundles of dried leaves, and knowledge in the scent of sap and steam. And at night, when the city of Tenochtitlan quieted and the torches burned low, some of them practiced a ritual nearly. Forgotten today, they slept inside smoke. Not metaphorically, not as a dream image. They literally slept in chambers filled with medicinal vapor, their mats placed just beside small, slow-burning fires of bark, ash, and resin. To the Aztecs, this wasn't strange. It was simply what the body needed after the healer had spent the day absorbing pain. Because healing, in their view, wasn't only about fixing illness, it was about carrying imbalance out of the body, often from someone else's body into your own. And if you didn't cleanse that burden, it stayed. And so, they turned to sleep smoke. The practice was called yaucolilistli, the journey of smoke through sleep. It was not common. Only the most experienced Ticitl used it, and they didn't do it every night, only after particularly intense rituals, or when they felt the weight of spiritual illness pressing against their chest like a stone. The smoke was made not of firewood, but of specific dried plants. Copal, always, sacred resin. Tlacoxochitl, frangipani, to calm the heart. Yautli, Aztec marigold, to cleanse the breath. Izquixochitl, for unseen wounds. These herbs were burned slowly in a clay dish called a tlazoli comitl, the pot of waste. A name that revealed its purpose, to absorb what had been taken on and give it to the fire. The healer would light the fire, speak no words, lie down on a thin mat beside it, and inhale slowly as the room filled with a gentle haze. They were not seeking dreams. They were seeking erasure, the removal of the residue left by pain. Because in the act of healing, especially spiritual healing, the Aztecs believed the Ticitl took in not just the patient's illness, but their fears, their confusion, their imbalance of tonali, the soul energy that often faltered under grief or trauma. The healer was a vessel, and that vessel had to be emptied before morning. These sleep rituals weren't dramatic. They were quiet, private. The room was never fully sealed, just enclosed enough for the smoke to settle and the breath to deepen. Sometimes another healer would watch over the sleeper, not to intervene but to ensure the fire stayed low and that the dreamer did not speak. Because if the healer spoke during sleep, it was considered a sign that the soul had not fully returned. Most Ticitl who used smoke sleep reported no dreams at all. That was the goal. No symbols, no messages, just silence, a sign that the smoke had done its work. But once in a while dreams did come, and when they did, they were strange. One healer dreamt of turning into steam and rising through cracks in the ceiling. Another dreamt of walking through a field of coughing flowers. Another saw themselves sweeping bones from a floor that stretched forever. These dreams were never shared with patients. They were written down only in private scrolls, kept not in temples but in bundles tied with reed string, stored beneath stone hearths or behind family altars. Because these dreams, the healers believed, were not for others. They were the smoke's memory, its record of what had been taken. There were taboos, too. A healer was never to sleep in smoke 2 nights in a row, never to enter the smoke chamber after being angered, never to bring in a flower freshly picked. Why? Because those things disrupted the flow. They changed the shape of the smoke. And the smoke, the Tisitl said, must always spiral upward, never sideways. The smoke wasn't a symbol, it was a being, one who took what you could no longer carry. Even after the Spanish arrived, when most healing practices were outlawed or labeled, heretical, the smoke sleepers continued. They no longer burned offerings in open courtyards. They used smaller fires, lower flames. Some switched to burning cinnamon bark or rosemary, herbs less suspicious to Christian friars. But the intention remained. Sleep inside what cleanses. By the 1700s, some families still remembered the practice, though they had no name for it. They would place